Unaware of her $250 million inheritance, her husband's family threw her out during a storm. You have exactly 1 hour to pack what you can carry and leave this house. Valeria Caldwell's voice cut through the howling wind like shattered glass, her manicured fingers drumming against the mahogany doorframe as rain lashed the windows behind her. Maren Caldwell stood frozen in her nightgown, 5-year-old Sylvie clinging to her leg, while Noah pressed herself against the hallway wall. Both children's eyes wide with the kind of terror that comes from watching adults destroy their world without explanation. I don't understand, Maren whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. This is our home. Joshua he's only been gone 3 weeks. Joshua is dead. Valeria's words landed with the finality of a coffin lid slamming shut. And this house belongs to the Caldwell Trust. It always has. You were here at our discretion, nothing more. The lawyer standing beside Valeria shifted uncomfortably, his expensive suit doing nothing to mask his obvious discomfort with the scene unfolding. Behind him, movers waited in the marble foyer like vultures, their presence making it clear this wasn't a discussion, it was an eviction. Thunder crashed overhead, and Sylvie began to cry. Not the dramatic wailing of a child seeking attention, but the quiet, devastating sobs of someone too young to understand why the people who were supposed to protect her were instead destroying everything she knew as safe. Hey, my friend, hope you're doing well. Drop a comment and let me know how you're feeling about this story so far and where you are watching from. If you haven't yet already, please click that subscribe button because tomorrow I have an even more special story for you, and I do not want you to miss it. Maren's hands shook as she knelt to embrace her daughters. 3 weeks ago, she had been a respected elementary school teacher with a loving husband and a secure future. 3 weeks ago, Joshua Caldwell had held her hand as his final breath escaped, whispering promises about how she would never have to worry, how the children would always be provided for. Now she was being cast out into a storm by the same people who had smiled coldly at his funeral, offering empty condolences while calculating how quickly they could reclaim their property. Mama, why is Grandma Valeria being mean? Noah asked, her 5-year-old directness cutting through the adult's pretense like a blade. Valeria's expression flickered, just for a moment, before hardening again. We're not being mean, child. We're being practical. Your mother needs to learn to provide for you properly, and she can't do that living in a house she never earned. Where are we supposed to go? Maren stood slowly, her teaching instincts kicking in to project calm for her children, even as panic clawed at her chest. It's nearly midnight. There's a storm. There's a motel on Route 9, Harold Caldwell spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the dismissive tone of someone accustomed to having his problems solved by other people. Surely you've saved something from your teaching salary over the years. The cruelty was breathtaking in its casual delivery. Maren had taught 5th grade for 8 years before Joshua's illness forced her to take extended leave to care for him. Her savings had evaporated during those final months, consumed by medical bills and medications that insurance refused to cover. The Caldwells knew this. They had sat through every doctor's meeting, had watched her sacrifice her career to nurse their son through his final battle with cancer. Joshua said we would always have a home here, Maren said quietly, her voice gaining strength as maternal fury began to override her shock. He promised the girls would never have to leave. Joshua said many things during his illness, Valeria replied with studied indifference. Grief and medication can make people optimistic about arrangements they have no authority to make. The mover stepped forward at some invisible signal, and Maren realized with crystalline clarity that this moment had been planned with military precision. The storm wasn't coincidental timing, it was strategic. Who would question the Caldwells' version of events when a young widow was forced to flee in the middle of the night during severe weather? The narrative would write itself, unstable woman, unable to cope with widowhood, making scenes and forcing the family's hand. 1 hour, Harold repeated, checking his Rolex with theatrical precision. The movers will assist you in gathering essential items. Everything else remains with the house. My paintings, Sylvie whispered, her artist's soul focused on what mattered most even in crisis. Mama, my paintings of Daddy. Maren looked at her daughter, Joshua's eyes staring back at her with an intensity that belonged to someone far older, and felt something shift inside her chest. Not breaking, hardening, like steel heated in a forge. We'll take everything that's ours, she said, her voice steady now with a resolution that surprised even her. Every drawing, every photo, every memory. You can have your house, but you can't have our family. Valeria's smile was razor-thin. How admirable. Though I wonder how long that sentiment will last when you're trying to pay rent on a teacher's salary with no job and 2 children to feed. The threat was clear. Surrender the children to us when poverty makes you desperate, or watch them suffer for your stubborn pride. But something in Marin's expression must have warned Valeria that this particular widow would not be as easily broken as anticipated. Mama, Noah tugged at Marin's nightgown, her small voice carrying the weight of wisdom beyond her years. Are we going to be okay? Marin knelt again, framing her daughter's faces with hands that no longer trembled. In Sylvie's eyes she saw Joshua's gentle creativity, his ability to find beauty in the smallest moments. In Noah's fierce gaze she recognized his protective instincts, his unwavering loyalty to those he loved. Her husband lived on in these children, and that meant he had given her everything she needed to fight for them. Yes, baby, she said, loud enough for the Caldwells to hear every word. We're going to be more than okay. We're going to be free. As thunder shook the house and rain pounded against windows that would no longer shelter them, Marin Caldwell began the most important battle of her life. She didn't know about the secret Joshua had carefully hidden from her and his family, didn't know about the lawyer who would come searching for her in exactly 11 months and 3 weeks. All she knew was that love had given her 2 daughters who trusted her completely, and that was the only wealth that mattered as she led them into the storm. The Sunrise Motel sat like a broken promise at the edge of town, its neon sign flickering weakly against the gray dawn sky. Room 12 smelled of industrial disinfectant and decades of other people's desperation. But it had 2 beds and a roof that didn't leak, which made it a palace compared to spending another hour in the Caldwells' marble mausoleum of cruelty. Marin sat on the edge of the scratchy bedspread, watching her daughters sleep in the pale morning light filtering through thin curtains. Sylvie had finally stopped crying around 3 a.m., exhausted from clutching the hastily packed box of her artwork like a life preserver. Noah had appointed herself guardian of their few possessions, creating a careful inventory on the back of a gas station receipt with the methodical precision of someone far too young to understand economics, but old enough to sense that everything they owned now fit into 4 cardboard boxes. The eviction had revealed truths Marin wished she could unknow. During their marriage, Joshua had handled their finances with the casual confidence of someone born to wealth. He paid bills, managed investments, discussed our money, in terms that made everything sound secure and permanent. Only now did she realize how carefully he had protected her from the reality that none of it had ever actually been theirs. The joint checking account had been frozen within hours of his death. A detail Harold Caldwell had mentioned with the satisfaction of someone revealing a particularly clever chess move. The credit cards bore the Caldwell name, making them invalid the moment she was no longer considered family. Even her teaching pension was months away from activation, tied up in paperwork that required an address she no longer had. Mama, Sylvie's voice was small and hoarse from crying. Is Daddy watching us? Marin moved to her daughter's bed, smoothing the tangled blonde hair that was so much like Joshua's. I think he is, sweetheart. And I think he's proud of how brave you were last night. I wasn't brave. I cried. Being brave doesn't mean you don't cry. It means you keep going even when you're scared. Noah sat up in the other bed, her dark eyes, Marin's eyes, surveying their temporary kingdom with the calculated assessment of a general planning strategy. How long can we stay here? The question Marin had been avoiding all night. The motel charged $52 per night, and she had exactly $418 in her wallet. The math was brutal in its simplicity. 8 nights if they ate nothing, fewer if they wanted to survive. We'll figure it out, Marin said, the phrase she had been repeating like a prayer since leaving the Caldwell estate. We always figure things out. But as she stood in the motel's tiny bathroom, splashing cold water on her face and staring at her reflection in the spotted mirror, Marin wondered if Joshua's gentle optimism had been naive. He had always believed that love could conquer practical problems, that good intentions could substitute for financial planning. Now she was learning the difference between romantic idealism and brutal reality. The breakfast at Denny's cost $23, an extravagance that made Marin's stomach clench with guilt. But the children needed normalcy more than she needed careful budgeting. They sat in a corner booth while morning commuters hurried past, and for 20 minutes Marin could pretend they were just a family having breakfast together instead of refugees from their own lives. The pancakes taste different, Sylvie observed, cutting her stack into precise geometric shapes with the artistic precision she brought to everything. Different how? Sadder. The observation was so perfectly Sylvie, filtering the world through emotional color rather than logic, that Marin felt her chest tighten with fierce protective love. Her daughter possessed Joshua's gift for seeing beauty in unexpected places, but also his vulnerability to being wounded by ugliness she couldn't understand. Noah had been systematically eating everything on her plate with mechanical efficiency, as if proper nutrition could solve their problems through sheer determination. At 5 years old, she had inherited Marin's practicality along with her stubborn refusal to surrender to circumstances beyond her control. "We need to find a house," Noah announced between bites of sausage. "A real house where we can stay. Houses cost money, baby. Then we need to get money." The simplicity of her logic was both heartbreaking and inspiring. "You're a teacher. Teachers make money teaching kids." Marin nodded, though the job market for substitute teachers in mid-October wasn't promising. Most positions had been filled weeks earlier, and her extended absence from the classroom to care for Joshua had left her without current references or connections. But Noah was right about the fundamental principle. They needed income, and teaching was what she knew how to do. The phone call to Jefferson Elementary came from the Denny's parking lot, Marin balancing her cell phone between her shoulder and ear while the girls played on the small playground nearby. Principal Matthews had been sympathetic but realistic. "Marin, I'm so sorry about Joshua. And I wish I had something permanent to offer, but we're fully staffed this semester." A pause filled with the sound of papers shuffling. "However, there might be some tutoring opportunities. Private clients, mostly. It's not steady work, but it's something." Something was more than nothing. Marin accepted the referral list gratefully, already calculating how many hours of tutoring it would take to afford basic rent somewhere, anywhere that wasn't a motel room slowly draining her savings. The first house she looked at was a disaster. Peeling paint, broken steps, windows covered with plywood sheets that gave it the appearance of a building with its eyes closed. But it was cheap, $800 a month, and the elderly landlord, Mrs. Danvers, had kind eyes and didn't ask probing questions about employment history or credit scores. "You have good children," Mrs. Danvers observed, watching Sylvie and Noah explore the weedy backyard with cautious optimism. "Good children deserve a stable home." The house needed work, extensive work, but it had 3 bedrooms, a Kit Danvers that functioned, and most importantly, it was available immediately. Marin signed the lease with trembling hands, using nearly half her remaining cash for the security deposit and first month's rent. As they stood in the empty living room that evening, surrounded by their 4 boxes of belongings, the magnitude of their situation became clear. They owned almost nothing. No furniture beyond what they could carry. No dishes, towels, or basic household items. No safety net beyond Marin's determination to create one from thin air. "It feels too big," Sylvie whispered, her voice echoing in the empty space. Marin understood what she meant. The Caldwell mansion had been filled with generations of accumulated wealth, antique furniture, oil paintings, Persian rugs that had cost more than most people's cars. This house felt hollow by comparison, like a stage set waiting for actors to bring it to life. But there was something else in the emptiness. Possibility. Freedom from the weight of other people's expectations, and the suffocating sense of living in a museum dedicated to someone else's achievements. "We'll fill it with our things," Marin promised, sitting cross-legged on the hardwood floor and pulling both girls into her lap. "Our drawings, our books, our memories. We'll make it ours." The first betrayal came disguised as kindness, delivered by Claire Whitman, who had been Marin's closest friend during the years when being married to Joshua meant access to the exclusive social circles of old money families. Claire arrived at their new house 3 days after they moved in, carrying casseroles and wearing the carefully neutral expression of someone performing an uncomfortable duty. "The house is character," Claire said diplomatically, her eyes taking in the peeling wallpaper and water-stained ceiling with barely concealed dismay. "Very authentic." They sat at the card table that currently served as their dining room furniture, drinking coffee from paper cups while the children played in the empty bedrooms upstairs. Claire's designer handbag sat beside her chair like a reproachful reminder of the life Marin had lost. "Valeria asked me to check on you," Claire said eventually, her voice carrying the careful tone of someone delivering a message she didn't particularly want to share. "She's concerned about the girls, about whether this arrangement is really in their best interests." Marin felt the familiar chill of understanding. This wasn't a social visit. This was reconnaissance. "The girls are fine. We're all fine." "Of course you are," Claire agreed quickly, but her eyes continued cataloging evidence of their reduced circumstances. It's just that, well, Valeria. She worries about stability, about the children's education and social development. She mentioned that Whitfield Academy has openings in their kindergarten program. Whitfield Academy, where tuition cost more than most people's annual salaries and admission required the right family connections along with academic achievement. The children would receive an elite education, certainly, but they would also learn that their worth was determined by their family's social standing, something they currently lacked. Sylvie and Noah are perfectly happy in public school. Are they, though? Claire's voice carried a hint of steel beneath the superficial concern. Sylvie seems so withdrawn, and Noah is showing signs of aggression that might benefit from professional guidance. The accusation hit like a physical blow. Marin had been watching her daughters carefully, monitoring their adjustment to their new circumstances with the trained eye of someone who understood child development. Yes, Sylvie had become more introspective, processing their upheaval through art rather than words. Yes, Noah had become more protective, but that was a natural response to trauma, not pathological behavior. My daughters are grieving, Marin said quietly. They lost their father 3 weeks ago, then they were forced from their home. They're adjusting remarkably well, all things considered. Claire nodded with practiced sympathy. Of course they are. You're doing your best under difficult circumstances. But sometimes a mother's best isn't enough to provide what children really need. The words were designed to wound, and they succeeded. Every new parent's deepest fear was failing their children, being inadequate to meet their needs despite loving them desperately. Claire had found that vulnerability and pressed on it with surgical precision. After Claire left, Marin sat alone in the empty living room, listening to her daughters' voices drifting down from upstairs where they were creating elaborate games from cardboard boxes and imagination. Their laughter was genuine, unforced, the sound of children who felt secure in their mother's love despite their changed circumstances. The visit had been a warning shot. The Caldwells weren't finished with their campaign to reclaim the children. They were simply changing tactics, using former friends to gather ammunition for a more sophisticated assault on her fitness as a mother. That night, as she tucked the girls into sleeping bags on mattresses she'd bought secondhand, Marin made a silent promise to Joshua's memory and her daughter's future. She would prove that love and determination could triumph over wealth and influence. She would show the Caldwells that their granddaughters were thriving under her care, not despite their reduced circumstances, but because of the values she was teaching them about resilience, authenticity, and the things that truly mattered. She didn't know that her strength was being tested according to her late husband's design rather than the Caldwells' cruelty. All she knew was that her daughters were counting on her to build a life worthy of their trust, and she would not fail them. The battle for their family had only just begun. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in November, delivered by a courier who waited while Marin signed for it with hands that had grown rough from scrubbing floors and painting walls. The return address made her stomach drop: Caldwell and Associates, Legal Counsel. The same firm that had orchestrated her eviction was now reaching out again, and Marin knew with crystalline certainty that whatever they wanted, it would not be in her favor. She waited until the girls were at school before opening it, needing privacy to absorb whatever fresh cruelty the Caldwells had devised. The legal language was dense and intimidating, but the core message was devastatingly clear. They were filing for emergency custody of Sylvie and Noah, citing material changes in circumstances and concerns about the children's welfare and stability. The documentation was thorough and damning. Photographs of their modest rental house, taken from angles that emphasized the peeling paint and overgrown yard. Financial records showing her irregular tutoring income and mounting bills. Statements from concerned community members, detailing the children's adjustment difficulties and their mother's apparent inability to provide adequate supervision. Claire Whitman's betrayal was laid out in clinical detail. She had documented Sylvie's withdrawal and emotional instability, and Noah's aggressive behavior and premature assumption of adult responsibilities. Every confidence Marin had shared during their friendship, every moment of vulnerability or doubt, had been weaponized into evidence of her inadequacy as a mother. The hearing was scheduled for the following Friday. 5 days to find a lawyer she couldn't afford, to mount a defense against accusations that contained just enough truth to be believable. Yes, their living conditions were modest. Yes, money was tight. Yes, the children had struggled with the transition from wealth to poverty. But they were thriving in ways that couldn't be measured by bank statements or property values. Marin sank into the Kit Danvers chair she'd bought at a yard sale for $3 and read the papers again, looking for some legal loophole or procedural error that might give her hope. Instead, she found only the crushing weight of a system designed to favor those with resources over those with love. The phone call to Principal Matthews at Jefferson Elementary came from a place of desperate strategy. If the Caldwells wanted to paint her as an unfit mother, she needed witnesses who had seen her children's actual behavior, not the manufactured crisis narrative being constructed by their former social circle. "Marin," Principal Matthews said after she explained the situation, "I have to tell you, this is highly unusual. In my 20 years in education, custody battles usually involve some genuine concern about abuse or neglect. From what I've observed, Sylvie and Noah are adjusting remarkably well to their circumstances." The validation should have been comforting, but Marin knew that a public school principal's testimony would carry little weight against the expert witnesses and child psychologists the Caldwells could afford to bring to court. "Would you be willing to testify about their progress?" A long pause. "Of course. Though I should warn you that the other side will likely argue that their current school environment is somehow inadequate compared to what they could receive elsewhere." That afternoon, as Marin walked through their neighborhood searching for perspective and calm, she noticed details she had been too stressed to see before. Mrs. Danvers working in her garden, always ready with a kind word and practical advice. Tommy Rodriguez teaching Noah to ride the bicycle someone had donated to their family. Sylvie sitting on their front steps, sketching the elderly man who fed stray cats every morning with the same dedication other people brought to formal jobs. This was community. This was belonging. This was the life she and Joshua had talked about wanting for their children. Connection to people who valued character over credentials, who measured success by how you treated others rather than what you owned. But the legal system wouldn't see it that way. The judge would see a struggling single mother living in a rental house in a working-class neighborhood, unable to provide the educational and cultural advantages that substantial wealth could offer. The Caldwells would present themselves as stable grandparents with the resources to ensure their granddaughter's future success. The catastrophic realization hit her as she watched Sylvie drawing. She might actually lose this battle. Love and good intentions might not be enough to overcome the vast disparity in resources and social influence. The system was designed to favor stability, and stability was often measured in dollars rather than devotion. That evening, after the children were asleep, Marin called every lawyer in the phone book, searching for someone who might take her case on a payment plan or pro bono basis. Most calls went straight to voicemail. Those who answered were sympathetic, but realistic about her chances without substantial funds for a proper defense. Finally, Maria Santos from Legal Aid returned her call at nearly 10 p.m. She was young, overworked, and handling 17 other cases, but she was willing to meet and discuss possibilities. "I have to be honest with you," Maria said during their coffee shop meeting the next morning. "Family court tends to favor grandparents with significant resources, especially when they can demonstrate financial stability and social connections. Your best strategy is probably to present yourself as a temporarily struggling but ultimately capable mother who's providing a loving, stable environment." "But what if that's not enough?" Maria's expression was kind but unflinching. "Then you need to be prepared for the possibility of losing custody, at least temporarily. Sometimes the system makes decisions that prioritize economic advantages over emotional bonds." The words hit Marin like physical blows. She had been so focused on fighting the Caldwells' attempts to control her life that she had underestimated their willingness to destroy it completely. They weren't just trying to force her into compliance. They were prepared to remove her children from her life entirely. Walking home through the November cold, Marin felt the weight of her isolation settle around her shoulders like a shroud. Joshua's illness had consumed the last 2 years of their marriage, leaving her no time to maintain friendships outside the shallow social connections that had evaporated the moment she was no longer useful. Her own parents had died when she was in college, leaving her with no extended family to provide support or testimony about her character. The Caldwells had systematically stripped away every support system she might have relied upon, isolating her completely before launching their final assault. It was psychological warfare conducted with legal precision, designed to leave her defenseless against their superior resources. But as she turned onto her street and saw the warm light glowing from their modest windows, Marin felt something shift inside her chest. Not despair, not surrender, something harder and more dangerous, the kind of fierce determination that came from having nothing left to lose. She thought about Joshua's final words, his promises that everything would be all right, that she would never have to worry about providing for their children. At the time, she had assumed he was referring to life insurance or modest savings. Now she wondered if there had been something else in his voice, some deeper confidence that she had been too grief-stricken to recognize. Inside, Sylvie was awake despite the late hour, sitting at the Kit Danvers table with her art supplies spread around her like a protective circle. She was working on a painting that made Marin's breath catch, their family of 3 standing together, but with a 4th figure rendered in translucent colors, barely visible but unmistakably present. "I can't make Daddy look right," Sylvie said without looking up from her work. "He's there, but he's not there." Marin knelt beside her daughter's chair, studying the painting with the same intensity she brought to analyzing lesson plans. The translucent figure had his hands on the shoulders of the solid figures, herself and the children, in a gesture that looked protective, as if he were shielding them from dangers they couldn't see. "Maybe he doesn't need to look like he did when he was alive," Marin suggested softly. "Maybe he looks different now because he's helping us in a different way." Sylvie considered this with the seriousness she brought to all artistic decisions. Like a guardian angel? Something like that. As they cleaned up the art supplies together, Marin made a decision that surprised her with its clarity. She would fight the custody battle with everything she had, but she wouldn't fight it from a position of weakness or apology. She would show the court exactly who she was, a woman who had lost everything material but gained something more valuable in return, the absolute certainty of what truly mattered. The Caldwells expected her to crumble under pressure, to eventually surrender the children in exchange for visiting rights and financial support. They had calculated that poverty would break her spirit and force her into compliance with their vision of proper child-rearing. They had miscalculated completely. Standing in her modest Kit Danvers, surrounded by the evidence of a life built from love rather than money, Marin felt the fear transform into something that felt suspiciously like anticipation. The custody hearing would be her opportunity to expose the Caldwells' cruelty, to show a judge that wealth without compassion was no foundation for raising children. She didn't know about the trust fund that would solve all her financial problems. She didn't know that Joshua's seeming carelessness about their future had actually been careful planning to ensure she would discover her own strength before discovering his safety net. All she knew was that her daughters were counting on her to prove that some things couldn't be bought, controlled, or taken away by people who confused money with power. The real battle was about to begin, and Marin Caldwell was finally ready to fight it on her own terms. The courthouse steps felt like climbing toward judgment itself as Marin walked beside Maria Santos, her borrowed dress hanging slightly loose on a frame that had grown thin from months of careful meal portions and restless nights. Behind them, Sylvie and Noah held hands with the solemnity of children who understood their entire future was being decided by strangers in black robes. Inside the marble corridors, the Caldwells held court like visiting royalty. Valeria wore pearls that probably cost more than Marin's annual rent, while Harold consulted with a legal team that looked like it had been assembled for a corporate merger rather than a family dispute. Their expert witnesses, a child psychologist from Harvard, a private school administrator, a financial planner, waited in expensive suits, armed with reports that would paint Marin's love as inadequate compared to their resources. "Remember what we discussed," Maria whispered as they approached the courtroom. "Answer directly, don't get defensive, and let them show their true colors." Judge Catherine Morrison had a reputation for fairness, but also for pragmatism. She had spent 20 years making decisions about children's welfare, which meant she had learned to weigh emotional bonds against practical considerations. Marin could only hope that her years as a teacher had given her some insight into what real child development looked like, beyond the theoretical frameworks the Caldwell's experts would present. Valeria's testimony was delivered with the polished certainty of someone accustomed to having her opinions treated as facts. She spoke about the children's obvious distress at their reduced circumstances, their social isolation from appropriate peer groups, and their mother's inability to provide educational opportunities consistent with their intellectual capacity. "Mrs. Caldwell," Maria cross-examined, "how many times have you visited your granddaughters in their current home?" "I've seen enough to assess their living conditions." "That's not what I asked. How many times have you been inside their house?" Valeria's pause was telling. "Their mother has made it clear that we're not welcome." "So your assessment of their home environment is based on photographs?" reports from concerned friends, observable evidence. The admission hung in the courtroom like a confession. Valeria had been gathering intelligence about her granddaughters' lives without ever bothering to actually participate in them. Her concern was theoretical, based on assumptions rather than observation. Harold's testimony focused on financial projections and educational advantages, delivered with the detached precision of a business presentation. Private school tuition, college funds, cultural enrichment opportunities, social connections that would benefit the children throughout their lives. His vision of proper child-rearing sounded impressive until Maria began asking about emotional considerations. "Mr. Caldwell, when did you last have a conversation with either Sylvie or Noah about their feelings regarding their father's death?" That's not really my area of expertise. We felt it was better to focus on practical arrangements." "And who did they talk to about their grief?" "There are professionals for that sort of thing." The pattern emerged clearly under Maria's questioning. The Caldwells viewed their granddaughters as assets to be properly managed rather than human beings to be loved and understood. They could provide financial security, but they had no interest in providing emotional connection. Dr. Patricia Henley, the child psychologist the Caldwells had hired, presented her report with academic authority that was intimidating until Maria began examining her methodology. The comprehensive evaluation had consisted of a single session with each child, conducted in the Caldwell's attorney's office. Hardly a neutral environment for assessing children's emotional states. "Dr. Henley, in your report you described Noah as showing premature assumption of adult responsibilities. Can you elaborate?" "She demonstrates protective behaviors toward her sister that are inappropriate for a 5-year-old. This suggests anxiety about her mother's ability to provide adequate care." "Or," Maria countered, "it suggests a normal sibling bond strengthened by shared experience." "Did you consider that interpretation?" "The intensity of the protective behavior is concerning." "Based on your single observation session?" The expert's credibility began to erode as Maria systematically exposed the superficial nature of her assessment. Dr. Henley had diagnosed dysfunction based on brief interactions, without considering the context of loss and transition that would make any child's behavior temporarily different from statistical norms. But the most devastating moment came when Valeria's mask finally slipped. Under questioning about her relationship with her late son, she revealed the depth of her disapproval of his marriage choices. "Joshua was influenced by romantic notions that weren't practical for someone in his position," she said, her voice carrying years of frustrated authority. "His marriage was understandable given his illness, but not necessarily in the family's best interests." The courtroom fell silent. Valeria had just implied that her son's deathbed marriage to the woman he loved had been a mistake driven by sickness rather than genuine feeling. The casual cruelty of reducing Joshua's deepest relationship to an error in judgment revealed exactly who the Caldwells really were. Judge Morrison's expression shifted perceptibly. "Mrs. Caldwell, are you suggesting that your son's marriage was somehow invalid?" "I'm suggesting that decisions made during terminal illness may not reflect a person's best judgment about family responsibilities." The damage was immediate and irreversible. Valeria had revealed her true feelings about Marin's place in the family, her belief that the marriage itself had been illegitimate. How could she claim to want what was best for children whose very existence she seemed to view as an inconvenience? Marin's testimony was simple and direct. She spoke about bedtime stories and homework help, about Sylvie's art projects covering their refrigerator and Noah's careful budgeting of her allowance to buy birthday presents. She described their neighborhood friends, their teachers' positive reports, their gradual healing from the trauma of loss and displacement. "My daughters are thriving," she said quietly, looking directly at Judge Morrison. "Not because they have everything they want, but because they know they are loved unconditionally. They're learning that family is built on commitment and care, not on bank accounts and social status." The most powerful moment came when Principal Matthews took the stand. His testimony was unscripted and passionate, describing children who were engaged in learning, kind to their classmates, and showing remarkable resilience in the face of major life changes. "In 20 years of education, I've seen many children from wealthy families who are emotionally neglected and many children from modest circumstances who are deeply loved and secure. Sylvie and Noah Caldwell fall firmly into the second category. But the turning point came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Danvers, the elderly landlord, had apparently been observing the family more closely than Marin realized. Her testimony, delivered in accented English, but with absolute clarity, painted a picture of daily life that contradicted every assumption the Caldwells had made. Every morning, I see mother walk children to school, rain or shine. Every afternoon, she is waiting when they come home. Every evening, I hear them laughing together, doing homework, reading stories. This is good family. Happy family. Children who are loved this way, they grow strong. The contrast was stark. The Caldwells could offer material advantages, but had demonstrated no understanding of their granddaughters as individuals. Marin could offer limited resources, but unlimited devotion to their well-being. During the lunch recess, Valeria cornered Marin in the courthouse hallway, her composure finally cracking under the pressure of a legal battle that wasn't proceeding according to plan. "You're being incredibly selfish," Valeria hissed, her voice low enough to avoid the attention of passing attorneys and court staff. "Those children deserve better than what you can provide. You're letting your pride destroy their futures." "I'm giving them what they need most," Marin replied calmly. "A mother who puts their emotional well-being ahead of social expectations. Love doesn't pay for college tuition or provide professional opportunities. And money doesn't provide the security that comes from knowing you're valued for who you are rather than what you can contribute to someone else's reputation." Valeria's eyes glittered with something dangerous. "You think you've won something here today, but this is far from over. There are other ways to ensure children receive proper care." The threat was veiled but unmistakable. If the custody battle failed, the Caldwells would find other methods to assert control over their granddaughters' lives. Marin felt a chill of recognition. This wasn't just about legal guardianship. It was about power, and people like the Caldwells didn't surrender power gracefully. The afternoon session focused on character witnesses, and the contrast between the two sides became even more pronounced. The Caldwells presented references from country club associates and business partners who spoke in abstract terms about family reputation and social responsibility. Marin's witnesses were the people who actually knew her children: teachers, neighbors, the librarian who had helped Sylvie choose books about art and healing. Tommy Rodriguez's grandmother testified about the afternoon Noah had helped her carry groceries when arthritis made the task difficult. The local pharmacist described how politely both girls behaved during their mother's errands, how they waited patiently and thanked him by name. These weren't dramatic stories, but they painted a picture of children who were being raised with kindness, consideration, and community connection. As closing arguments approached, Maria leaned over to whisper a strategy adjustment. "They're starting to look desperate." Valeria's outburst about the marriage damaged their credibility, and their witnesses sound like they're reading from a script. "Stay confident." But Marin could see the calculation in Harold's eyes, the way he consulted with his legal team during breaks. They hadn't expected this level of resistance, but they weren't defeated. Men like Harold Caldwell didn't build business empires by accepting initial losses as final outcomes. The real pressure came that evening, after the court day had ended. Marin arrived home to find an envelope slipped under her door. Not legal documents this time, but something more personally threatening. Inside were photographs of Sylvie and Noah walking to school, playing in their yard, sitting on the front porch with Mrs. Danvers. The message was clear: "We're watching your every move." The photographs were technically innocent, but their implications were chilling. The Caldwells were documenting the children's daily routines, possibly building a case for future legal action, or simply demonstrating that privacy was an illusion when you opposed people with unlimited resources for surveillance. That night, as Marin checked the door locks twice and pulled the curtains closed against watching eyes, she realized that the custody hearing was only the beginning of a longer war. The Caldwells had revealed their willingness to use any weapon available, legal, social, psychological, to achieve their goal of controlling their granddaughters' lives. But something had shifted during the day in court. Marin had seen her community rally around her family, had watched the judge's expression change as the Caldwells' true nature became apparent. She wasn't fighting this battle alone anymore, and the support she had discovered gave her strength she hadn't known she possessed. Standing at her daughter's bedroom door, watching them sleep peacefully despite the chaos surrounding their lives, Marin felt a fierce certainty crystallize in her chest. The Caldwells could surveil and threaten and manipulate, but they couldn't change the fundamental truth that had emerged in court today. Sylvie and Noah were thriving because they were deeply loved, and no amount of money could replicate that foundation. The custody decision would come next week, but the real battle was already won. Her daughters knew who their real family was, and that knowledge would protect them from whatever schemes the Caldwells devised next. Judge Morrison's decision came on a gray Friday morning that matched the weight in Marin's chest as she sat beside Maria Santos, waiting for words that would determine whether her daughters would go home with her or leave with strangers who happened to share their DNA. After careful consideration of all testimony and evidence presented, Judge Morrison began, her voice carrying the measured authority of someone who had made these impossible decisions too many times. This court finds that while the petitioners can certainly provide substantial material advantages, the children's current living situation demonstrates emotional stability and genuine care. Marin's heart began to lift, but the judge wasn't finished. However, this court is also concerned about the long-term financial security of the children's current arrangement. Therefore, I am ordering a 6-month supervised visitation period, during which the petitioners will have significant access to the children while they remain in their mother's custody. The words hit Marin like a physical blow. She had won, technically, but the victory felt hollow and temporary. 6 months of the Caldwells having court-mandated time with Sylvie and Noah, 6 months of supervision and evaluation, 6 months of living under a microscope while her former in-laws looked for any excuse to return to court with a stronger case. Valeria's smile was sharp with satisfaction. She had lost this battle, but positioned herself perfectly for the war. Court-ordered visitation meant regular access to the children, opportunities to document any problems with their current situation, chances to gradually shift their loyalties through the subtle application of wealth and privilege. Every other weekend and Wednesday evenings, the judge continued, as well as alternating holidays. Mrs. Santos, please coordinate with opposing counsel to establish the specific schedule. Maria squeezed Marin's arm in what was meant to be reassurance, but they both understood the reality. The Caldwells now had legal weapons they hadn't possessed before, and they would use every minute of mandated access to build their case for permanent custody. Walking out of the courthouse felt like leaving a battlefield where the outcome remained uncertain despite the day's apparent victory. Harold fell into step beside Marin as they descended the stone steps, his voice carrying the reasonable tone of someone extending an olive branch. "This doesn't have to be adversarial," he said quietly. "We all want what's best for the children. Perhaps we can find some common ground during this transition period." Marin stopped walking and turned to face him fully, seeing the calculation behind his diplomatic words. Common ground would have been supporting me after Joshua died instead of throwing me out in a storm. Common ground would have been helping me care for your granddaughters instead of trying to take them away. Harold's reasonable mask slipped slightly. "You're being emotional. This arrangement gives you time to prove you can provide adequate stability. Use it wisely." The threat was clear. 6 months to demonstrate worthiness according to standards she had no voice in setting, measured by metrics designed to favor wealth over love. The Caldwells would spend those months documenting every small problem, every moment of normal childhood difficulty, every sign that modest resources meant inadequate care. That evening, Marin sat her daughters down at their Kit Danvers table to explain the new arrangement. How do you tell 5-year-olds that court strangers had decided their grandparents deserved forced access to their lives, regardless of how those grandparents had treated their family? "Do we have to go?" Noah asked, her protective instincts flaring at the mention of the Caldwells. "Can't we just stay here with you? The judge says you need to spend time with Grandpa Harold and Grandma Valeria. It's only for visits, and you'll always come home to me." Sylvie had been quiet during the explanation, processing the information through her artistic lens for emotional meaning. "Are they going to try to keep us?" The question was so perceptive it took Marin's breath away. At 5 years old, Sylvie had grasped the underlying dynamic that the legal system had tried to disguise with talk of visitation schedules and family relationships. "They're going to try," Marin said honestly, deciding her daughters deserved truth rather than false reassurance. "But we're not going to let them. We're a family, and families stick together." The first supervised visit took place the following Saturday at the Caldwell estate, with a court-appointed social worker observing interactions and taking notes that would become part of the permanent record. Marin watched through the window as Harold showed the children the library with its leather-bound books and marble fireplace, as Valeria offered tea parties in the formal dining room where servants presented cookies on silver platters. The luxury was seductive, and Marin could see its effect on her daughters. Sylvie was fascinated by the art collection, asking questions about paintings and sculptures that cost more than most people's cars. Noah was impressed despite herself by the indoor pool and tennis court, amenities that made their modest backyard seem shabby by comparison. But something else was happening during these visits, something the social worker's notes couldn't capture. The Caldwells were conducting psychological warfare disguised as grandparental affection. They praised the children for being smart enough to appreciate nice things, while subtly criticizing their current lifestyle. They talked about private schools and exotic vacations as if these opportunities were being denied by their mother's stubbornness rather than her poverty. "Your mother loves you very much," Valeria said during one tea party, her voice carrying just the right note of gentle concern. "But sometimes love isn't enough. Sometimes children need advantages that love alone can't provide." The poison was administered in small doses, designed to create doubt rather than immediate rebellion. The children still hugged Marin tightly when she picked them up, still chattered about their days, and refused to be separated at bedtime. But she could see the confusion growing in their eyes, the beginning awareness that their current life might be inadequate compared to what their grandparents could offer. The breaking point came during the third week of supervised visits. Marin arrived at the estate to find Sylvie in tears and Noah standing protectively beside her sister, both children clearly upset about something that had happened during their afternoon with the Caldwells. "What's wrong?" Marin knelt beside Sylvie, who was clutching a small canvas that had been torn almost in half. "I painted our house," Sylvie sobbed. "I painted our house with the garden and Mrs. Danvers and Tommy and everyone, and Grandma Valeria said it wasn't very good because poor people aren't beautiful to paint." The casual cruelty was breathtaking. Valeria had deliberately destroyed a child's artwork because it depicted a life she deemed unworthy of artistic attention. It was psychological abuse disguised as aesthetic criticism, designed to make Sylvie ashamed of the community and circumstances that had become her world. She said real artists paint beautiful things, Noah added, her 5-year-old voice trembling with rage. She said if we lived with them, Sylvie could learn to paint proper pictures of proper places. Marin felt something cold and dangerous crystallize in her chest. The Caldwells weren't content to wage war on her adequacy as a mother. They were actively undermining her daughter's sense of belonging in their own lives, teaching them to be ashamed of the community that had embraced them and the values that had sustained them through crisis. The social worker's report from that visit would note that the children had become distressed during the interaction, but would likely attribute it to adjustment difficulties rather than deliberate emotional manipulation. The system wasn't designed to recognize subtle psychological abuse when it was administered by wealthy grandparents in elegant surroundings. That night, Marin held both daughters while they cried out their confusion and hurt. How do you explain to children that their grandparents' version of love was really a form of control? How do you protect them from people who had legal rights to access their lives? "Are we poor, Mama?" Sylvie asked as Marin tucked her into bed. "We don't have a lot of money," Marin said carefully. "But we have everything we need, and we have each other. Grandma Valeria says poor people can't give children proper opportunities." The words hit Marin like physical blows. Valeria was systematically destroying her daughter's contentment with their lives, replacing satisfaction with dissatisfaction, gratitude with resentment. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation, and it was working. "Do you think our life is bad?" Marin asked gently. Sylvie considered the question seriously. "I like our house and our friends and Mrs. Danvers and my art teacher at school. But Grandma Valeria says I could have better things if we lived differently." The poison was taking hold. Valeria was teaching the children to measure their lives against imaginary alternatives rather than appreciating what they actually possessed. It was the beginning of a lifetime of dissatisfaction, the belief that contentment required constant acquisition of better circumstances rather than gratitude for present blessings. 3 days later, the devastating revelation arrived in the form of a phone call from Maria Santos. Her voice was tight with anger and disbelief as she delivered news that changed everything Marin thought she understood about her legal situation. "The Caldwells have filed a motion claiming that you've been withholding information about estate assets," Maria said without preamble. "They're alleging that Joshua had financial resources you haven't disclosed to the court." Marin's blood turned to ice. "That's impossible. I've been completely honest about our financial situation. You've seen all the documentation. They're claiming there was a trust or foundation that you've deliberately concealed to gain sympathy from the judge. They're demanding a complete financial investigation and suggesting that your apparent poverty was a performance designed to manipulate the court's decision." The accusation was so outrageous it took Marin's breath away. She had struggled with genuine poverty, had worried about rent and groceries and utility bills with the desperate anxiety of someone who understood that homelessness was always one crisis away. The idea that this suffering had been some elaborate deception was both insulting and terrifying. How would they even know about something like that if I don't? Maria's pause was telling. That's what worries me. Either they have information you don't, or they're fishing for something they hope exists. Either way, they've managed to cast doubt on your credibility just when the supervised visitation period is building their case for permanent custody. The timing was perfect and suspicious. Just as the children were beginning to show signs of being influenced by the Caldwell's wealth and manipulation, just as the social workers' reports were starting to document adjustment issues during the transition period, suddenly there were questions about Marin's fundamental honesty with the court. That evening, Marin searched through every document she had saved from her marriage, every bank statement and insurance policy and legal paper that might contain some clue about hidden assets. She had been married to Joshua for 6 years, had shared his bed and his meals and his deepest fears about dying young. How could there be financial arrangements she knew nothing about? But as she searched, fragments of memory began to surface. Joshua's confidence during his final weeks that everything would be all right, that she would never have to worry about providing for their children. His mysterious meetings with lawyers during his illness, meetings he had attributed to estate planning, but had never discussed in detail. His gentle insistence that she focus on caring for him rather than worrying about practical arrangements. Had he been protecting her from knowledge of resources that could have prevented months of struggle and fear? Had his apparent carelessness about their financial future actually been careful planning she was too grief-stricken to recognize? The questions tormented her as she lay awake that night, listening to her daughters breathe peacefully in the next room. If the Caldwells were right about hidden assets, then her entire narrative of struggle and sacrifice was built on a foundation of ignorance. The judge who had sympathized with her poverty might feel deceived. The community that had rallied around her apparent need might question her authenticity. But if the Caldwells were wrong, if this was simply another strategy to undermine her credibility, then she was facing a new level of psychological warfare. They were gambling that the mere suggestion of deception would be enough to destroy the trust she had built with the court and her supporters. Either way, the devastating realization was clear. The Caldwells had managed to weaponize hope itself against her. The possibility that Joshua had left resources to ensure his family's security had become a threat to keeping that family together. Standing at her daughter's bedroom door, watching them sleep in beds she had bought secondhand but furnished with unlimited love, Marin felt the ground shifting beneath everything she thought she knew about her life. The real battle was just beginning, and she no longer knew what she was fighting for or against. The financial investigation felt like having her life dissected by strangers who spoke in legal terminology but understood nothing about love or sacrifice. Court-appointed accountants combed through every bank statement from her marriage, questioning expenses that had seemed normal at the time but now appeared suspicious under scrutiny. Why had Joshua paid certain bills in cash? Why were there gaps in the financial records during his illness? Why did some investment accounts show activity that Marin couldn't explain? Mrs. Caldwell, the lead investigator said during their third meeting, your husband maintains several accounts that you claim no knowledge of. That's unusual for a married couple. Marin sat in the sterile conference room, feeling like a criminal for having trusted her dying husband to handle their finances. Joshua was sick for 2 years. I was focused on caring for him, not monitoring his business dealings. But surely you discussed your financial future? Estate planning? Provisions for the children? The questions made her marriage sound calculated rather than loving. Yes, they had talked about the future, but in the context of hope rather than preparation for death. Joshua had been optimistic about treatments that might extend his life, determined to focus on living rather than dying. Financial planning had seemed like giving up. Now that optimism looked naive, and Marin's trust in her husband appeared either willfully ignorant or deliberately deceptive. The investigators found evidence of money transfers to accounts she'd never heard of, payments to legal firms she didn't recognize, investment activities that suggested resources far beyond what she'd claimed in court. The worst part was that she couldn't explain any of it. Each new discovery made her look more dishonest, while leaving her more confused about the man she'd been married to for 6 years. The children's behavior during supervised visits was deteriorating in ways that played perfectly into the Caldwell's strategy. Sylvie had become withdrawn and anxious, asking constant questions about why they couldn't have nice things like other families. Noah was acting out with explosive anger that seemed disproportionate to minor frustrations. The social worker's reports documented every incident with clinical precision. Temper tantrums, bedwetting, difficulty sleeping, resistance to returning home after visits. The symptoms looked like emotional neglect rather than the normal response of children caught between competing loyalties. The children appeared to be struggling with identity confusion, Dr. Sarah Kim wrote in her evaluation. They're receiving conflicting messages about their worth and their future, which is manifesting in behavioral regression and emotional instability. What the report didn't capture was the systematic way the Caldwells were creating that confusion. During visits, they praised the children for being too special for their current circumstances while expressing concern about their mother's ability to provide proper guidance. They offered treats and privileges that created stark contrasts with everyday life, then expressed surprise that the children seemed unhappy when those luxuries were withdrawn. "Your mama loves you," Valeria would say during their carefully observed interactions. But sometimes adults make choices that aren't in children's best interests. That's why grandparents exist, to make sure children get what they really need. The psychological manipulation was sophisticated and effective. The children were learning to associate their current life with deprivation and their grandparents with abundance. But the lesson was delivered so subtly that it looked like natural preference rather than calculated influence. Maren could see her daughters slipping away from her one visit at a time. They still hugged her and said they loved her, but there was a new distance in their eyes, a growing awareness that their life with her might not be the best option available. The breaking point came during a parent-teacher conference at Jefferson Elementary. Miss Rodriguez had requested the meeting to discuss concerns about both children's academic and social adjustment, but her observations painted a picture that would devastate Maren's custody case if it reached the court record. "Sylvie has stopped participating in art activities," Miss Rodriguez said gently. "When I ask her to draw or paint, she says her pictures aren't good enough. She seems to have lost confidence in her creative abilities." The child who had once filled their refrigerator with colorful drawings was now afraid to express herself artistically. Valeria's cruel criticism of her painting had poisoned something essential in Sylvie's developing identity. "Noah has become aggressive with classmates," Miss Rodriguez continued. "Yesterday she told another student that her family was better than theirs because she had rich grandparents. When I tried to discuss appropriate behavior, she said I didn't understand because I was poor too." The words cut Maren deeper than any legal document. Her daughter was learning to measure human worth by financial status, exactly the toxic mindset she'd tried to protect them from. The Caldwells were succeeding in converting the children to their value system through systematic exposure to luxury and privilege. Walking home from the school, Maren felt the weight of inevitable defeat settling over her shoulders like a shroud. Every strategy she tried to counter the Caldwells' influence backfired. When she tried to explain that money didn't determine a person's value, the children asked why they couldn't have nice things if money wasn't important. When she emphasized the importance of kindness and community, they pointed out that their grandparents were successful and respected while their neighbors were struggling. The logic was 5-year-old simple and devastatingly effective. If their mother's values were correct, why was their life so much harder than their grandparents' life? If love was more important than money, why couldn't love pay for the things other children had? That evening, as Maren tried to help with homework in their modest kitchen, Sylvie asked the question that shattered her remaining hopes. "Mama, why didn't Daddy leave us enough money to live nicely?" The innocence of the question made it even more painful. Sylvie wasn't trying to hurt her mother. She was genuinely confused about why their father's love hadn't translated into financial security. The Caldwells had successfully planted the seed that adequate provision was part of parental responsibility, and Joshua's failure to ensure their comfort reflected poorly on both him and Maren. "Daddy was sick for a long time," Maren said carefully. "Medical bills cost a lot of money. But Grandpa Harold says rich people have insurance for that. He says Daddy should have planned better." The poison had taken root so completely that the children were now repeating the Caldwells' criticisms of their own father. Harold had reframed Joshua's death from tragic loss to parental irresponsibility, teaching his granddaughters that their current struggles were the result of their parents' poor judgment rather than unfortunate circumstances. The final devastating blow came in the form of a phone call from Maria Santos, her voice tight with defeat as she delivered news that destroyed Maren's last hope of maintaining custody. The financial investigation found evidence of a trust fund worth approximately $250 million, Maria said without preamble. It was established in your name, but managed through a law firm you claim never to have heard of. Marin's legs gave out, and she sank onto the kitchen floor as the magnitude of the betrayal became clear. Not betrayal by Joshua, but betrayal by her own ignorance of his true intentions. He had left her wealthy beyond imagination, but the discovery came too late to matter. The court is going to assume you knew about this money and deliberately concealed it to gain sympathy, Maria continued. Your entire narrative of struggle and sacrifice now looks like an elaborate deception designed to manipulate the judge's emotions. But I didn't know, Marin whispered. I swear I had no idea. It doesn't matter what you knew. It matters what you can prove, and there's no way to prove ignorance of your own financial situation. The Caldwells have successfully painted you as either incompetent or dishonest, and neither image supports your custody case. The cruel irony was perfect in its completeness. Joshua had tried to ensure his family would never face financial hardship, but his secret generosity had become the weapon that would tear that family apart. The money that was meant to protect his daughters would instead be used to justify removing them from their mother's care. Marin hung up the phone and sat on her kitchen floor, surrounded by the evidence of a life built from love and determination, knowing that none of it mattered anymore. The modest house she'd made into a home, the community relationships she'd cultivated, the daily sacrifices she'd made to provide stability and security for her children. All of it was now irrelevant compared to the bank account she'd never known existed. That night, she lay awake listening to her daughter's sleep, knowing these might be among the last nights they would share under the same roof. The custody hearing would be reconvened within the week, and this time the Caldwells would have unassailable evidence that Marin was unfit to make decisions about substantial wealth or her children's futures. She had fought with everything she had, but sometimes love wasn't enough to overcome systematic manipulation and legal maneuvering by people with unlimited resources and no moral constraints. The darkest realization was that Joshua's final gift to his family had become the instrument of their destruction, and there was no one left to blame except the husband she'd trusted completely and the system that valued money over devotion. Outside, a storm was building, and Marin could hear the wind rattling their windows like a reminder of the night this nightmare had begun. Soon, she might be facing another storm alone, but this time without even her daughters to give her strength. The descent into darkness was complete, and there was no light visible anywhere on the horizon. The reconvened custody hearing felt like entering a courtroom designed for her execution. Judge Morrison's expression was carefully neutral, but Marin could see the disappointment behind her professional mask. A judge who had sympathized with a struggling widow now faced a woman who appeared to have deceived the court about fundamental facts of her situation. Harold Caldwell's opening statement was delivered with the quiet satisfaction of someone presenting an airtight case. Your Honor, we now have conclusive evidence that Mrs. Caldwell has been less than truthful about her financial circumstances. The trust fund in question contains assets worth approximately $250 million, managed by the law firm of Harrison and Associates for the past 18 months. The numbers fell into the courtroom like physical weights. 18 months meant the trust had been established before Joshua's death, during the time when Marin was supposedly unaware of any significant financial resources. To outside observers, it looked impossible that a wife could be ignorant of such massive wealth. Furthermore, Harold continued, the children's behavior during supervised visitation has shown marked improvement. They express enthusiasm about educational opportunities and cultural activities that their current living situation cannot provide. They've begun to understand that their father intended them to have advantages commensurate with their inheritance. Valeria nodded from her seat. Every inch the concerned grandmother, who had discovered her granddaughters were being deprived of their rightful opportunities by a mother too stubborn or disturbed to accept reality. Maria Santos rose for what felt like a futile defense. Your Honor, Mrs. Caldwell maintains she had no knowledge of this trust fund. The establishment of such financial arrangements without spousal knowledge, while unusual, is not impossible, particularly when a terminal patient is trying to protect his family from additional stress during his final months. Judge Morrison consulted the thick file of financial records that had been compiled during the investigation. Mrs. Caldwell, you're asking this court to believe that your husband established a $250 million trust fund without your knowledge or participation? Marin stood slowly, feeling the weight of everyone's skeptical attention. Your Honor, my husband was dying. I spent 2 years focused entirely on his medical care and our children's emotional needs. Joshua handled all our financial affairs because I was too exhausted and overwhelmed to participate in business decisions. But surely such massive wealth would have been apparent in your daily life? Investment statements, legal correspondence, changes in your standard of living. The question revealed how impossible her situation had become. To wealthy people, significant money was always visible through lifestyle changes and financial activity. The concept of deliberately living modestly while possessing great wealth was so foreign to their experience that it seemed inherently deceptive. We lived simply by choice, Marin said quietly. Joshua came from wealth but preferred a modest lifestyle. We wanted our children to understand the value of things rather than taking abundance for granted. Harold's laugh was soft but devastating. Your Honor, this narrative of voluntary simplicity might be believable if Mrs. Caldwell had acknowledged the resources after her husband's death. Instead, she appeared in court claiming poverty while sitting on a fortune that could have eliminated every financial concern she testified about. The logic was unassailable and completely damning. Why would someone with access to unlimited wealth struggle with rent payments and grocery bills unless they were either incompetent to manage their affairs or deliberately dishonest about their circumstances? Dr. Kim's supplemental report provided the psychological framework that justified removing the children from their mother's care. The discovery of significant hidden assets suggests either severe psychological denial or deliberate deception, both of which raise serious questions about Mrs. Caldwell's judgment and stability. Children require caregivers who can make rational decisions about their welfare, including appropriate utilization of available resources. The clinical language made Marin sound either crazy or criminal. There was no third option that accommodated a woman who had genuinely been kept ignorant of her financial situation by a husband trying to protect her from additional complexity during his final battle with terminal illness. But the most devastating testimony came from an unexpected source. Sylvie and Noah had been interviewed privately by the court-appointed child advocate, and their statements revealed how completely the Caldwells' psychological campaign had succeeded. Both children expressed confusion about their living situation, the advocate reported. They don't understand why they can't have things other children have if their family has money. Sylvie in particular seems to blame her mother for choices that have made their life unnecessarily difficult. Marin closed her eyes as her daughter's innocent words were weaponized against her. Sylvie didn't understand trust funds or legal complications. She only knew that her grandparents lived in a beautiful house with art supplies and swimming pools, while she and her sister lived in a rental with second-hand furniture. Noah demonstrates protective behavior toward her sister that suggests anxiety about their mother's ability to provide adequate care. She's begun asking whether they might be better taken care of by their grandparents. The children's own voices had become evidence against her. The Caldwells had successfully convinced 5-year-olds that their mother was depriving them of opportunities they deserved, and the legal system was treating those manipulated opinions as legitimate expressions of preference. Judge Morrison called a brief recess, and Marin found herself alone in the hallway with Maria, both women understanding that the battle was essentially over. The combination of hidden wealth and children's statements created an insurmountable case for transferring custody to grandparents who could provide both material advantages and apparent emotional stability. There's still one option, Maria said quietly. You could negotiate shared custody with primary residents alternating between households. It would keep you in the children's lives while acknowledging their grandparents' resources. The suggestion felt like choosing which leg to amputate. Shared custody would mean the children spending equal time in both environments, gradually becoming more comfortable with luxury and privilege while growing less attached to the modest life she had worked so hard to create. But it would also mean not losing them completely. Half time with her daughters was better than no time, and perhaps she could use those periods to counteract the Caldwells' influence while demonstrating that authentic love was more valuable than material abundance. When court reconvened, Marin made the choice that felt like tearing her heart in half. Your Honor, I would like to propose a modified custody arrangement, she said, her voice steady despite the pain of what she was about to sacrifice. I believe the children would benefit from maintaining relationships with both their mother and their grandparents, with time divided equally between households. Judge Morrison nodded with obvious relief. A negotiated settlement would avoid the necessity of making a definitive ruling about competing claims to the children's best interests. But Harold Caldwell wasn't finished. Your Honor, While we appreciate Mrs. Caldwell's willingness to compromise, we remain concerned about the psychological impact of dividing the children's time between radically different environments. The instability could be more damaging than beneficial. The objection was calculated to force the court into an all-or-nothing decision. The Caldwells didn't want shared custody, they wanted complete control, and they were gambling that the judge would award them primary custody rather than risk continued instability for the children. Valeria rose from her seat, her voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to getting her way through reasonable-sounding demands. Your Honor, we're not trying to punish Mrs. Caldwell or deny her access to her children. We simply believe that children of this age need consistency and stability above all else. Perhaps supervised visitation would be more appropriate while Mrs. Caldwell works through her financial and psychological issues. Supervised visitation. The phrase hit Marin like a slap, reducing her from equal parent to potentially dangerous influence who required monitoring during contact with her own daughters. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Morrison considered options that would determine not just custody arrangements, but the entire future trajectory of two little girls caught between competing visions of what their lives should look like. In that silence, Marin realized she was facing the impossible choice that would define the rest of her life. Accept supervised visitation and maintain some connection to her daughters while watching them grow up as privileged strangers. Fight for shared custody and risk losing them completely if the judge decided the Caldwell's arguments about stability were more compelling than her claims of genuine love. Or do something else entirely. Something that would require more courage than she'd ever possessed, but might be the only way to save her family from destruction by people who confused wealth with wisdom. Looking at her daughters sitting in the front row, still too young to understand that their entire future was being decided by adults who had never asked what they actually wanted beyond the leading questions designed to elicit predetermined answers, Marin felt a clarity she hadn't experienced since the night she'd been thrown out in the storm. The choice wasn't between different custody arrangements. The choice was between surrendering to a system designed to favor wealth over love, or fighting for something more important than legal victory. Her daughters deserved to grow up knowing that some things couldn't be bought, controlled, or manipulated by people who measured success in dollars rather than devotion. It was time to stop playing by the Caldwell's rules and start playing by her own. Your Honor, before you make your final decision, I have something I need to say. Marin's voice cut through the courtroom tension like a blade, surprising everyone including herself. She hadn't planned this moment, but standing on the edge of losing everything that mattered, she suddenly understood what Joshua had been trying to tell her during those final conversations about strength and love. Judge Morrison looked up from her notes with raised eyebrows. Mrs. Caldwell, your attorney has already presented your case. This isn't about my case anymore. This is about my daughters understanding something that no legal ruling can give them. Harold started to object, but the judge held up her hand, curiosity overriding protocol. In 20 years on the family court bench, she had learned to recognize moments when the real truth was about to emerge. Marin turned to face Sylvie and Noah, who were sitting wide-eyed in the front row, sensing that something important was happening, but not understanding what. Girls, do you remember the story Daddy used to tell you about the little bird who thought she needed golden feathers to be beautiful? Sylvie nodded solemnly. It had been one of Joshua's favorites during his final months, told during quiet evenings when pain medication made elaborate storytelling difficult, but simple truths still needed sharing. The little bird spent all her time wishing for golden feathers like the peacock's, thinking that would make her special. But what made her truly beautiful was her song, and her kindness to other birds, and the way she took care of her nest. The golden feathers would have been pretty, but they wouldn't have made her a better bird. Valeria's expression shifted from satisfaction to concern as she realized where this conversation might be heading. This wasn't capitulation or negotiation. This was something more dangerous, honesty delivered directly to the children without adult filters or manipulation. Grandma Valeria and Grandpa Harold think you need golden feathers, Marin continued, her voice gaining strength as she found her footing in familiar teacher territory. They think having expensive things and fancy schools will make you better people. But Daddy and I always believed that what makes you special is who you are inside, not what you own. But Mama, Sylvie said, her 5-year-old voice carrying across the silent courtroom. Grandma says we could have art lessons with real teachers and beautiful supplies if we lived with them. You could, sweetheart. And those things might be fun. But would they make your paintings more true? Would they make your heart bigger or your hugs warmer? Noah frowned, processing this with the intensity she brought to all important questions. Grandma says you're keeping us from having good things because you don't know how to use Daddy's money. The accusation hung in the air, delivered with the brutal honesty that only children possess. Valeria had successfully convinced a 5-year-old that her mother was either incompetent or selfish, and now that poison was being spoken aloud in front of the judge who would determine their future. Here's what I know about Daddy's money, Marin said, kneeling to her daughter's eye level despite the formal courtroom setting. I just found out about it a few days ago, and you know what my first thought was? Both children shook their heads, captivated by their mother's calm certainty in a room full of adults who seemed angry and afraid. I thought about how sad Daddy would be if that money made you think you were better than other people. How worried he would be if you started measuring your friends by what they owned instead of how kind they were. Harold stood abruptly. Your Honor, this is hardly appropriate courtroom procedure. Judge Morrison's voice was firm. Sit down, Mr. Caldwell. I want to hear what she has to say. Marin looked directly at the judge, speaking with the clarity that came from finally understanding what she was really fighting for. Your Honor, my husband left us that money because he loved us and wanted us to be secure. But he hid it from me because he knew something about wealth that his parents never learned. Money can be a tool for good, but it can also be a poison that destroys everything it touches if you're not careful. She turned back to her daughters. Do you remember Mrs. Danvers, who taught you how to plant vegetables? Do you remember Tommy Rodriguez, who shared his bicycle when ours was broken? Do you remember how proud you felt when you helped carry groceries for the elderly man down the street? Both children nodded, their expressions showing the first signs of confusion about the narrative they'd been fed during supervised visits. Those people don't have much money, but they have something more important. They have generous hearts. They know how to love without counting the cost. Valeria couldn't contain herself any longer. Your Honor, this is exactly the kind of idealistic nonsense that's been filling these children's heads. The real world requires practical considerations, not fairy tales about the nobility of poverty. I'm not talking about the nobility of poverty, Marin said, her teacher instincts taking over as she addressed the entire courtroom. I'm talking about the importance of character. I'm talking about raising children who understand that their worth isn't determined by their bank account. She looked at Harold and Valeria directly, no longer intimidated by their wealth or social position. You want my daughters because you think they need things I can't provide. But what you can't provide is the understanding that happiness comes from gratitude, not acquisition. That strength comes from overcoming challenges, not from having everything handed to you. Dr. Kim shifted uncomfortably in her seat as Marin continued. These past months have been the hardest of our lives, but they've also been the most important. My daughters have learned that they can survive anything as long as they have each other. They've learned that neighbors who care about your well-being are more valuable than acquaintances who only know your net worth. Sylvie raised her small hand, as if she were in school. Mama, if we have Daddy's money, does that mean we're rich now? The question cut to the heart of everything the adults had been arguing about while ignoring the children's actual concerns. It means we have choices we didn't have before, Marin said carefully. But it doesn't change who we are or what's important to us. Will we still live in our house? Will Mrs. Danvers still be our neighbor? Noah's questions revealed what the custody battle had really been about. Not the children's welfare, but competing visions of what their lives should look like, imposed by adults who had never asked what the children actually valued. Judge Morrison leaned forward, her expression showing genuine interest rather than judicial obligation. Mrs. Caldwell, what exactly are you proposing? Marin took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would determine whether her family survived intact or was torn apart by people who confused control with care. I'm proposing that my daughters stay with me while we figure out together how to use their father's gift responsibly. I'm proposing that they continue going to Jefferson Elementary, where their teachers know their names and care about their progress. I'm proposing that they maintain the friendships and community connections that have sustained us through the hardest year of our lives. Harold's voice carried sharp impatience. And what about their educational opportunities? Their cultural development? Their preparation for the responsibilities that come with significant wealth? They'll learn responsibility by watching me use some of their inheritance to help other families who are facing the same struggles we faced. They'll develop culturally by understanding that art and music and literature exist to make life more meaningful, not to demonstrate social status. Maria Santos looked stunned as she realized what Marin was doing. Instead of fighting for custody within the legal framework that favored the Caldwells, she was redefining the entire conversation around values rather than resources. "Your Honor," Valeria said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "This woman clearly has no understanding of how to manage substantial wealth or prepare children for their future responsibilities. And you clearly have no understanding of how to love children without trying to control them," Marin replied, her voice steady but carrying steel underneath. "You've spent months trying to convince my daughters that their life with me was inadequate, that they needed to be ashamed of our community and our choices." She looked at Sylvie and Noah again, her voice gentling. "But you know what? Even if we had known about Daddy's money from the beginning, I wouldn't have changed anything about this year. We learned that we could take care of each other no matter what happened. We learned that real friends don't abandon you when things get difficult. We learned that home isn't about having the biggest house, it's about having the biggest hearts." Sylvie slipped out of her seat and walked to her mother, wrapping her arms around Marin's waist in a hug that said more than any legal testimony. "I like our house," she whispered, loud enough for the court reporter to hear. "I like Mrs. Danvers and Tommy and my teacher who lets me draw when I'm sad." Noah joined her sister, her protective instincts now clearly directed toward preserving their family unit rather than escaping it. "I don't want to live with Grandma and Grandpa," she said firmly. "They're nice to visit, but they don't understand our games or why we like helping people." Judge Morrison set down her pen and looked at the Caldwells, who were watching their carefully constructed case collapse in real time. "Mr. and Mrs. Caldwell, you've presented compelling arguments about resources and opportunities. But I'm looking at two children who seem very clear about what they value and where they feel safe." Harold made one last attempt to salvage their strategy. "Your Honor, children this young can't possibly understand the long-term implications of these decisions. They need adult guidance about their best interests. They need adults who listen to them instead of manipulating them," Judge Morrison replied. "And frankly, this court is disturbed by evidence that the supervised visitation period was used to systematically undermine these children's contentment with their current situation." The revelation hung in the courtroom like a confession. The judge had seen through the Caldwell's psychological warfare, recognizing it for what it was, an attempt to manufacture dissatisfaction that would justify removing the children from their mother's care. "Mrs. Caldwell," Judge Morrison said, addressing Marin directly, "this court awards you full custody of your children, with the requirement that you work with a financial advisor to establish appropriate trust fund management for their inheritance." The words hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. Full custody. Complete vindication. Victory beyond what Marin had dared hope for during the darkest moments of the legal battle. But the real victory was smaller and more precious. Sylvie and Noah clinging to her, choosing love over luxury, demonstrating that Joshua's most important legacy had nothing to do with money. As they walked out of the courthouse into bright afternoon sunlight, Marin felt her husband's presence as clearly as if he were walking beside them. His gift hadn't been the trust fund, though that would provide security and opportunities. His gift had been the confidence that his wife and daughters would choose character over convenience, community over status, love over everything else the world might offer. The storm that had driven them from the Caldwell estate had led them home to themselves, and no amount of wealth or manipulation could take that away from them now. 1 year later, Marin stood in the same courthouse where she had nearly lost everything, but this time she was there by choice. The Meridian Foundation's annual report lay open on the conference table, showing how Joshua's inheritance had been transformed into something he would have been proud of. The foundation had quietly funded emergency housing for 12 families facing eviction. It had established art therapy programs at 3 elementary schools. It had created scholarship funds for single parents returning to college and emergency medical assistance for families battling terminal illness without adequate insurance. Each recipient receives help without strings attached, Marin explained to the Foundation's board of directors, which included Mrs. Danvers, Principal Matthews from Jefferson Elementary, and surprisingly Harold Caldwell. Harold had undergone his own transformation during the past year. The custody battle had forced him to confront the difference between providing things and providing love, and he had chosen to honor his son's memory by supporting rather than controlling his granddaughter's upbringing. The Rodriguez family received housing assistance after their apartment flooded, Marin continued. 3 months later, Mrs. Rodriguez began volunteering at our Family Resource Center. The Thompsons got emergency medical funding when their daughter needed surgery. Now Mr. Thompson tutors other children facing extended hospital stays. The pattern was consistent across all their programs. Families who received help without judgment or conditions often became helpers themselves, creating a network of support that multiplied the foundation's impact far beyond its financial contributions. Sylvie had become the foundation's unofficial artist-in-residence, creating paintings that illustrated the stories of families they had helped. Her latest series, Home is Where Love Lives, showed diverse families in modest circumstances but radiant with connection and joy. "I paint happy families now," she explained to visitors who toured the foundation's community center. "Not because they have everything they want, but because they have everything they need to love each other." Noah had appointed herself the foundation's financial advisor, despite being only 6 years old. She kept careful records of how money was spent and insisted on visiting families they helped to ensure the assistance was making a real difference. "We can't just give people money and hope it works," she told Harold during one of his visits to their house. "We have to make sure they know someone cares about them, not just their problems." The wisdom was distinctly hers but echoed lessons she had learned from watching her mother transform crisis into opportunity, isolation into community, loss into love. Their house on Maple Street had become an unofficial community center. Mrs. Danvers lived in the converted apartment above the garage, having become the children's full-time grandmother by choice rather than obligation. Tommy Rodriguez and his family had moved into the house next door when the foundation helped his parents buy their first home. The neighborhood had transformed too. What had once been a collection of struggling families trying to survive individually had become a network of mutual support. Children played safely in yards watched by multiple adults. Elderly residents received help with groceries and home repairs. Single parents shared childcare responsibilities and encouragement. "You created something here that money can't buy," Lisa Martinez observed during one of her frequent visits. She and Marin had grown closer over the past year, their relationship deepening naturally as the crisis-driven intensity of the custody battle gave way to normal life rhythms. Lisa understood that she was joining a family that would always include Joshua's memory, and she had embraced that reality with grace that surprised even Marin. The children adored her not as a replacement for their father, but as an addition to their expanding definition of family. "I didn't create it," Marin replied, watching Sylvie teach art techniques to neighborhood children in their backyard studio. "We all did. That's what happens when people stop competing and start collaborating." The most surprising transformation had been Valeria's gradual acceptance of their choices. She still lived in the Caldwell estate, still moved in exclusive social circles, but she had begun volunteering at the Foundation's programs with the same intensity she had once brought to charity galas and country club events. "I spent 70 years thinking that helping people meant writing checks to appropriate organizations," she admitted during a quiet moment at Sylvie's 7th birthday party. "I never realized that actual help requires getting your hands dirty and your heart involved." Her relationship with the children was still formal compared to Mrs. Danvers's warm grandmother presence, but it was genuine rather than manipulative. She had learned to value their happiness over her own expectations, to support their choices rather than trying to control their futures. The custody battle had become a cautionary tale told quietly in legal circles about the dangers of mistaking wealth for wisdom, of assuming that material advantages automatically translated into better outcomes for children. Judge Morrison had used the case in several professional presentations about the importance of listening to children's voices rather than adults' assumptions about their best interests. But the real measure of their success wasn't legal or financial. It was visible in the confidence with which Sylvie approached new challenges, the joy with which Noah helped other children feel welcome at school, the way both girls spoke about their father as a continuing presence in their lives rather than a tragic loss. "Do you think Daddy knows about the foundation?" Sylvie asked one evening as they worked together in the community garden that had replaced the Caldwell's formal landscaping. "I think he planned it," Marin said, helping her daughter plant tomatoes that would be shared with families throughout their neighborhood. "I think he knew that the best way to take care of us was to give us a way to take care of other people." The insight was profound in its simplicity. Joshua's hidden inheritance hadn't been about providing luxury or security. It had been about giving his family the resources to become the kind of people he had always believed they could be: generous, compassionate, connected to something larger than their own comfort. As autumn settled over their thriving community, Marin received a letter that would have terrified her a year earlier, but now filled her with quiet anticipation. Another family was facing eviction during a winter storm. Another mother was desperate to protect her children from circumstances beyond her control. Another opportunity to transform crisis into hope. The Foundation's emergency response team was already mobilized. Mrs. Danvers had prepared the guest apartment for temporary housing. Tommy's mother had organized meals and children's clothing. The community that had formed around their family's healing was ready to extend that healing to others who needed it. Standing on the front porch where she had once sat in despair, watching paint peel while wondering how she would feed her children, Maren marveled at how completely her life had changed. Not because of the money, though financial security had eliminated daily anxiety about survival. Not because of the legal victory, though custody of her daughters had been essential to everything that followed. The transformation had come from understanding what Joshua had been trying to tell her during those final conversations about strength and love. Real wealth wasn't about having enough money to solve problems. It was about having enough love to face problems together, enough community to ensure no one faced them alone, enough purpose to transform personal pain into universal healing. The storm that had driven them from the Caldwell estate had been the beginning of their real journey home. Home to themselves, home to their values, home to a community built on the understanding that everyone deserved to be loved not for what they possessed, but for who they were. As she tucked Sylvie and Noah into beds in the house they had chosen rather than inherited, surrounded by neighbors who had become family and memories that had become strength, Maren felt Joshua's presence as clearly as if he were standing beside her. His greatest gift hadn't been the trust fund. His greatest gift had been the faith that love could triumph over any storm, that family could be built from choice rather than obligation, that true prosperity was measured in hearts touched rather than dollars accumulated. They were, in every way that mattered, completely rich.